Today I want to share with you how miscommunication between a gastroenterologist and an anesthesiologist resulted in horrible medical mistakes that led to this patient's death as a result of a colonoscopy. You want to know what this is all about? Come join me for a moment as I share with you this remarkable story. Hi, I'm Gerry Oginski. I'm a New York medical malpractice and personal injury attorney. This is a true story. A series of miscommunications between the GI doctor and the anesthesiologist during the course of a colonoscopy resulted in this patient's untimely and unnecessary death. So here's what happened. This patient had developed bleeding that she saw every time she went to the bathroom. She now told her daughter, who told her to go to her doctor. Her doctor recommended a gastroenterologist. The gastroenterologist said, listen, we need to find out where this bleeding is coming from. You need a colonoscopy. Now, even though she was in her mid-60s, she had never had a colonoscopy before. And for those of you who don't know, the doctor takes a small, thin fiber optic tube and now inserts it into the butt and now up through the colon. The whole idea is to visualize and to see why this person is bleeding. What's going on here? And if there are any polyps along the way, the doctor will then remove the polyps and then send it off to pathology to get evaluated to see whether or not these are benign or cancerous. So now, during the course of the procedure, the gastroenterologist is in the middle of his procedure and he's snaking this thin fiber optic tube up into her colon until he reaches a point where he can't push forward anymore. As the doctor is trying to push this tube through her colon, the alarm went on for the pulse oximeter machine. That's a device that tells the doctor, the anesthesiologist, how much oxygen is perfusing through the patient's body. There was a problem. And now, when that alarm triggers, it could be one of two problems. Either the machine is malfunctioning or the patient's got a significant problem and now she's not getting sufficient oxygen. So this anesthesiologist decided to go focus on the machine first. And he's checking the machine, making sure it's plugged in, making sure everything's right. He then resets it and expects to see her oxygen level get back to normal. Well, there's a problem. It doesn't. So now he focuses attention on the patient. And he goes to check inside her mouth, and guess what? He finds that there is fluid built up in her mouth. So he decides, you know what, let me suction out her mouth. Hopefully she'll be able to breathe better. Well, he suctions out the mouth, and guess what? Her oxygen saturation levels do not improve. Now, he never communicates that fact to the GI doctor. The doctor says, hey, is everything okay? Because he heard the alarm trigger. And the anesthesiologist said, yeah, no problem, just keep going. That was mistake number one. Mistake number two is that the GI doctor should have stopped and abandoned his procedure when he encountered this difficulty of passing the colonoscope through her colon. That's problem number two. Now, the next thing, after he suctioned her mouth, you would think that things would improve. Well, it didn't. So now you have to begin to think, why isn't she getting sufficient oxygen? That's a problem. He never once considered the possibility that this patient aspirated. Now, what is aspiration? Aspiration is when the patient vomits whatever is left in the stomach and now comes up into their mouth. Now, in this instance, because the patient is sedated, they're under a medication known as propofol. So the patient is lightly sedated through an IV, but they're asleep. They won't remember anything that happens. Now, when they're asleep, they have no gag reflex. And normally, when you go ahead and vomit, you have that gag retching reflex. When you try and breathe in when you're awake, your body tries to prevent any fluids or other contents from going down into your airway. Well, what happens when you're asleep? Under anesthesia, you no longer have that gag reflex. And in this instance, we only learned this 2 years down the road because the doctors failed to tell the family what really happened until we brought a lawsuit, and during litigation, when I'm questioning these doctors under oath, is when I finally learned what really happened. So now, it turns out that the patient had vomited, but the doctor, the anesthesiologist, didn't realize it. So now he's only suctioning in her mouth. What ultimately we learn is that this patient had aspirated. So she had vomited up into her mouth, and in the next breath, inhaled those fluid contents directly down into her lungs. That's where it shouldn't be. You should not have fluid and stomach particulate into the lungs. Now there's no free flow of air in the lungs. That's known as aspiration pneumonia. You now have foreign content, foreign material in the lungs. And that can be life-threatening. That can be deadly if not timely recognized and treated. And unfortunately in this case, this anesthesiologist failed to recognize that she had aspirated. He failed to go ahead and suction anything beyond the vocal cords to see if he can get any fluid or particulate matter out of the airway beyond the vocal cords. And in addition to that, he never told the GI doctor to stop his procedure. So because of these series of miscommunications, the patient's oxygen level kept getting lower and lower and lower. And you need to know that in order to survive, we need a sufficient amount of oxygen to our brains. And when our brains do not get enough oxygen, you can suffer tremendous brain damage, profound brain damage that can ultimately lead to death, which is exactly what happened here. The GI doctor finally says, you know what, I'm done with the procedure. And by the way, he never figured out why this patient was bleeding rectally. And now they send her back to recovery room. The anesthesiologist then goes off to do another procedure. The GI doctor then goes off to do another procedure. Guess what? They leave this patient in the hands of a recovery room nurse with instructions to simply have her head tilted up. That's it. But over the next 30 minutes, this woman can't breathe properly. She's gasping for air. She's struggling to breathe, which is a signal, which is an indication that this patient has a significant problem getting air into her body and getting that air perfused throughout the body to get her oxygen that she needs to survive. 30 minutes later, the recovery room nurse frantically is searching for the anesthesiologist. Please, you've got to come quickly. The patient can't breathe. He now comes in, and now there's a discussion about whether or not to call an ambulance. And you know what? Somebody pipes up and says, no, 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 don't call an ambulance. We don't want to get the other patients in the waiting room all alarmed. And over the next 15 minutes, the anesthesiologist doesn't call an ambulance. Finally, he says, you know what? You need to call an ambulance. So she's now taken to a closest emergency room. But by that point, she's already in a coma. She had already suffered significant and permanent brain damage. And because she had significant brain damage, now her other organs started to fail. The doctors call that multi-system organ failure. And now, 2 days later, this woman dies. Why? Because of a series of miscommunications that never, ever should have happened. A series of miscommunications that led to medical errors that never should have happened. This woman's death was entirely preventable. And the medical experts that I consulted with during this case were appalled to see that these two doctors violated the basic standards of medical care, not just once, not twice, not 3 times, but multiple times, when all of these things never, ever should have happened. So why do I share the story with you? I share it with you to give you one example of how medical miscommunication resulted in an untimely death for a woman who never, ever should have had this happen. You know, I recognize you're watching this video because you have questions or concerns about your own matter. Well, if your matter did happen here in New York and you're thinking about bringing a lawsuit, but haven't done so yet because you still have questions that need answers, what I encourage you to do is pick up the phone and call me. I can answer your legal questions. You know, this is something I do every single day, and I'd love to chat with you. You can reach me at 516-487-8207 or by email at Gerry, Gerry, at oginski-law.com. That's it for today's video. I'm Gerry Oginski. Have a wonderful day.